Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and welcome back to the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. In today's installment, we shall be covering episode 46, Scare Tactics, Part 2, or as it's known in the Japanese original, Midsummer Night's Ghost, Part 2. Now, before we start the review, I need to tell you that this episode is the second part of a two-parter, the third of the series, in fact. Due to this, I must highly recommend that before you continue watching this video, you check the review of part 1 out first, as not only is that a good video in its own right, but provides context to some of the events of this episode. Plus, in this video, I will be discussing this two-parter as a whole at the end of the video, so please do yourself a favor and watch that part first. Trust me, it's well worth a watch, and it's a pretty good episode as well. Anyway, resuming with the topic at hand, this episode was originally released in Japan on August 24th, 2002 as the 46th episode, while in the English dub, it was released on November 1st, 2003. Apparently, this was to better align with the US's Halloween, though it did miss the date, so it kind of comes off as pointless. And it also messes up the release dates of other episodes, but that's not really a problem with the episode itself. So let us begin with the episode proper now. The episode begins with a pretty decently lengthed recap of what happened in the last episode. It is here that we see the first change between versions. In the Japanese original, the recap is narrated by Tiff, whereas in the English dub, an unnamed and sadly uncredited voice actor does it. Both versions do a fine enough job, though I admit I do prefer when an actual character like Tiff does it, as it gives it a sort of more metatextual sense, and is far more substantive. That and the fact that they actually get credited, unlike this unnamed voice actor who has faded into obscurity. Anyway, it lasts for the first minute and 18 seconds, and then we see the jazzy intro. Regardless, in both versions, after this jazzy intro, we cut to Tiff and Kirby trapped inside the spooky house as a ghostly entity approaches the pair. They are these glowing balls of light which proceed to conglomerate into a more humanoid form that resembles Nightmare. And this monster has been dubbed the Particle Ghost by the fan community, as it doesn't technically have an official name. It also lacks a voice actor, but its eerie silence, I think, gives it a far more ominous presence, and frankly, it's a good monster that had quite an impact on me as a young child. The camera cuts to outside the haunted mansion as we see her brother, Tuff, and Meta Knight running towards the mansion, concerned for Tiff's well-being. Trapped in the haunted building, Tiff slowly comes to the realization that this is a real ghost, and the particle ghost lunges at the pair of children. Understandably, Tiff is scared and flees the entrance lobby. Kirby, who is unsurprisingly not really scared, follows after the girl into another room. We cut to outside to see Tuff tries to open the door, but it won't budge at all. Meta Knight, however, approaches and says to let him try his hand at opening the door. He pulls out his sword Galaxia and hits the door, but surprisingly, the door is able to withstand the mighty sword. Tuff asks why that happened, and Meta Knight explains that a powerful force, NME, is behind this whole thing. Tuff is confused at this before we cut to Tiff and Kirby, who have entered into an even more spooky room. This scares the girl before the particle ghost follows them into the room alongside a horrifying enemy-styled gargoyle that stares at the pair, scaring them and causes them to flee up a circular staircase. They run for quite some time before Tiff stops and realizes that this staircase is endless, going up far higher than it should given the outside size of the house indicates. A bat goes to attack Kirby. Tiff warns him, but it's too late as it hits Kirby, who falls onto the stair railing. He then begins sliding down so fast that even the normally stoic Kirby gets scared, and suddenly a CGI dragon head morphs into existence out of the banister and sticks its metal tongue out. That becomes a blade to scour the baby. The pink Star Warrior barely dodges this and falls into a set of heavy armor. More of that particle ghost appears, which, using its influence, shifts the armor, causing the hand and sword to fall off and almost crush Kirby. But luckily, Tiff warns him and he jumps out of the way as the two flee the particle ghost into another room. Not sure why they don't follow them in, but I guess the particle ghost was just not interested. But this room is even more horrific, with a grotesque greenish coloration and a skeletal shrine to Nightmare that begins bleeding what looks like dark blood. Ooh, creepy. Fearful, Tiff and Kirby flee the room and go upstairs to another room that is filled with loads of possessed clocks that are, frankly, extremely loud and creepy due to the CGI used. We see a bat one that looks like a wolf, a skull clock, an owl one. Heck, we even see a cameo of Erasum, who is a monster that could erase a person from everyone's memory. If you want to learn more about that horrifying concept, check out my previous review of the episode featuring the monster, episode 39, Escargon. Though frankly, I'm not exactly sure what he's doing here. I guess he just wanted a place to get out of the rain or something. All the clocks and lights cause both Tiff and Kirby great distress. I can relate given that I too dislike overloading amounts of flashing lights and sounds due to my autism. Even if the scene is not particularly scary, I still think it's a very intense one. We then cut outside in the severe storm where we see King Dedede and Escargoon wandering through the graveyard. Apparently, they're looking for those kids to get back at them for scaring them. The king gets sick due to the rain and thus sneezes on Escargoon like a can of bug spray. Escargoon is understandably disgusted at this, but notices the house on the hill. Interestingly, in the Japanese original, Escargoon exclaims that there really is a god, I guess happy to get out of the rain. 4Kids, not liking explicit religious references, removed it. As someone who has a rather libertarian view on religion, you can believe in what you want, I think that this censorship is kinda weirdly unneeded. Like, really, only losers and easily offended snowflakes would get offended by that. Regardless, in both versions, the two go over to the home and easily enter into it. Meta Knight and Tuff watch this, and the great star hero manages to throw Galaxia in such a manner that keeps the door open as the king goes to close it. We then cut back to Tiff and Kirby. The girl inspects some of the red liquid that got stuck onto her foot and realizes that it's just red-colored paint. She's confused as it can't be a prank being done by the Cappies. Her confusion is cut short, however, by the sound of the king loudly sneezing. They then see both the king and Escargoon pass by, with the king complaining loudly about his nose being congested, which I can sympathize with. Tiff then concludes that the king must be behind this when her brother finds her and says enemy is also part of this scheme. Realistically, the episode should end here as they leave, but no. As we cut to the room where we see the king and Escargoon sleeping in the same bed. This scene is one of the many reasons that there are many in the fandom that ship the two, and frankly, while I can see the homosexual undertones here, I think the relationship is kind of abusive, and frankly, I just can't really tolerate that kind of stuff. Abusive relationships are just really bad, you know. The camera pans to Tiff, Tuff, Kirby, and Meta Knight, watching the duo sleep. Escargoon seems to be semi-awake and looks at the kids, but seems not to register them and falls asleep again. This moment eventually leads to the king falling out of the bed, which awakens groggily the king. His sleepiness is stopped when he sees Escargoon being mysteriously lifted into the air. Oh! This terrifies the king, though we see it's actually Tuff and Meta Knight pulling a prank on the petty tyrant. The king, then thinking Escargoon is sleeping on the job, grabs a broomstick and repeatedly hits Escargoon in the head, who begs for him to stop, as the king does so, eventually stopping. Escargoon then sits up, and we see something that is frankly horrifying.
What the hell was that?
Okay, so this scene is without question the most horrifying thing in the entire anime series. Firstly, it is a reference to the 1973 supernatural horror film, The Exorcist, in which a little girl is possessed by the demon Pazuzu, and we see her grotesquely rotating her head a full 360 degrees. Heck, the Japanese version even had bloody cuts, which is similar to the movie in even more ways. Even more bizarre is that this scene, unlike everything else in the episode, is just completely unexplained. So we just have to leave it to the imagination why this exactly happened, which makes it even creepier. 4Kids version is slightly less scary since it airbrushes out all the bloody cuts, and in general makes the scene shorter. Regardless, this scene had a genuine impact on me as a kid, as I was actually kind of creeped out by it. We then see Tuff pull on a rope, and there is a large bucket of red paint that is dumped on the pair of two goobers. This is also another, admittedly much less horrifying reference to a classic horror movie, that being the 1976 film adaptation of the Stephen King novel Carrie, in which a bullied girl with telepathic powers snaps and proceeds to kill an entire school's worth of students and townsfolk. It's surprisingly a decent movie that had two far inferior remakes in 2002 and 2013. The king and Escargoon are doused in the paint and freak out. Dedede, seeing Escargoon covered in his sheets, thinks that it's some sort of bloody ghost, and the two eventually flee out of the room, horrified. The king runs down the hall before pausing near a strange painting. This painting then proceeds to come alive, giggling, and blows bubbles on the king. This is the second ghost to appear in the episode, being named as Charbon. Despite only appearing in this one scene, which is shortened slightly in the English dub, it's actually a fairly interesting monster. Firstly, its name is based off the Japanese word for soap bubble, Shabandama, which is, well, themed due to its abilities. Secondly, this monster was actually designed by a Japanese first grader for an art contest in Japan, which was held for a chance to cameo in the anime. and the original artwork was pretty cute with bubbles and a bubble Kirby. Though the bubbles from the wand look like small versions of his head, which is kind of creepy. In the Japanese original, Charbon has a red S on the shirt. 4Kids, for really no reason at all, remove the S. It seems kind of like a silly and unnecessary change. This monster is also one of the few monsters to neither fight nor heck even encounter Kirby. Its final fate is left uncertain, though it is assumed that it died due to events that we shall see later in the episode. Also, some have made a comparison to Chansey from Luigi's Mansion, as both are these grotesque ghost babies that have a weird hair shape. I mean, I kind of see it, and the fact that it's set in a haunted mansion does strengthen that, but it seems more like a coincidence than something intentional. Though, given it's a ghost, can it really die? All in all, there's surprisingly a large amount of stuff to talk about for what is in essence a glorified contest winner cameo. We then cut to Escargoon, who has arrived in a bathroom of sorts. He comments on how gross this red paint is and takes a shower to wash it off, the red substance. All seems fine as he washes it off with relative ease, but then King Dedede slowly approaches the snail from behind, and then to Escargoon's shock, he begins beating Escargoon to near death. Like, seriously, he beats him to the point of the snail fainting, and for some reason, this scene has way better shading than, like, pretty much the rest of the episode or even show. Now, this entire scene is a parody of the 1960s horror movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, which, while a pretty old reference and honestly a movie that I don't personally consider very scary, it is worth a watch and leads to a funny scene overall. In the Japanese version, this comparison was even more evident, with red paint washing into the drain and music that is even more akin to that of the scene from the movie. The king, who in what is a rare moment of clarity asks if Escargoon is okay when he realizes that he had just attacked his poor servant. It's also worth noticing that there is what is considered by some to be a minor continuity error here, as somehow the king was able to remove all the red paint from his body without taking a shower. I personally don't really see it as a big issue. He says he thought Escargoon was a ghost, to which the snail bemoans that ghosts do not take showers, to which the king says in noise that he was almost worried, which causes Escargoon to cry on how he's so happy that the king was concerned about this. Before this interaction can go any further, a Technicolor ghost rushes the pair and spooks them into a commercial break before they flee the room. It is then revealed that this ghost was in fact another prank by the kids Kirby and Meta Knight. We see the king and Escargoon flee down the halls, past a bunch of spooky things, and enter into a side room, though said room ends up being a weird torture chamber filled with the skeletons of the dead and torture devices. Dedede comments that this might be their final grave, until we see a screen in which the enemy sales guy calls them up and shocks the pair. He asks if they have been enjoying the haunted house, which understandably greatly annoys both the king and Escargoon, who says that they won't be scared into paying their bills. But the enemy sales guy explains that this whole spooky house is an elaborate trap for Kirby. Dedede demands further elaboration, and the enemy sales guy explains that if Kirby steps on the hidden transport disc dressed up as an altar of evil, then he will be teleported away from King Dedede and into enemies' clutches. The three evildoers laugh maliciously before the enemy sales guy says the king won't mind being the bait then for the trap, much to the king's chagrin. We then see that the next two scenes are oddly swapped in order in the English dub, which really ruins the mystery. In the Japanese original, we see Tiff, Tuff, and Kirby hearing the screams and pain of the king, who screams for help. In that moment, Tuff suggests that there might be real ghosts that have captured the king, given that they're not scaring him anymore currently. Hearing his screaming pain and feeling genuine concern, the sympathetic trio run towards the king yelling. We then see them come across an abandoned camera that bears the king's logo. Tuff picks it up and his sister asks if there's anything recorded on it. We then see Dedede and Escargoon seeming to record a paranormal encounter. Tiff wonders what scared the two so seriously and tells Tuff to skip ahead until they get a scene of the king just standing there in a corner, menacingly. This is the final reference to a classic horror movie in the episode, clearly meant to allude to the 1999 Blair Witch Project, which I saw, and it was actually genuinely rather creepy. Definitely one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. Also, what an odd thing to reference, as the scene only works if you saw the movie, which if you haven't, it just seems like the king is standing there menacingly before Escargoon faints. We then see the king being crucified on a bloody cross, which shocks the two kids. The king, in what's pretty obvious acting, blabbers about how they must leave him behind and escape with Kirby before seeming to die. Despite how obvious this is, Tuff says they gotta do something, with Tiff saying they'll try. However, Meta Knight shows up and asks what is going on, before the boy explains that they gotta go save the king and hand him the camera before the three run off to help. In the Japanese original, we then see a scene of Escargoon painting Dedede in red paint, and it's revealed that this whole thing is a trick. I think the English dub really messed up the tension by revealing this scene first. It just undercuts the whole video camera scene and renders it pointless. Suspicious, Meta Knight reviews the footage before we cut back to the torture dungeon, where we see the king complain about how long it is taking for Kirby to get to him, and that the heat is making the paint drip into his eyes, which stings and genuinely makes him start screaming in pain. Tiff, in another room, hears this, and the three run off to help the king, and eventually enter into the torture chamber. The king complains about how it took them so long, which almost blows the whole scheme, as Tuff is quick to notice that he's not really acting like he's in real danger, as Escargoon looks from the shadows. The king manages to almost salvage it as he begs Kirby for help, and the poor baby naively runs up to help the king, despite Tiff warning him not to. Kirby goes and leaps towards the altar, but Meta Knight bursts in and yells that it's a trap and knocks Kirby with his Galaxia in such a way that he just barely saves Kirby from being teleported to the enemy headquarters. This scene is another reference, though, this time not to a horror movie. You see Meta Knight yelling the phrase, "It's a trap!" is a reference to the slightly obscure 1983 science fiction film you may know of as Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, in which noted rebel leader Admiral Akbar says, "It's a trap!" in reaction to an imperial, trap. It has become somewhat of a running meme on both the internet and real life, and is referenced in a lot of media, like this episode. The king, still blinded by pain and paint, asks if the trap worked, but the enemy sales guy says it obviously didn't, and that he'll have to send over a monster to drag Kirby over, as it is revealed to everyone that this whole thing was a trap. Tiff says that they won't succeed, but is cut off when the sales guy sends over the monster of the week, Gabon.
This little bonehead's a real shocker.
So, Gabon first appeared in Kirby's Dream Land 3, released back in 1997. There, he was a pretty basic enemy that wears a skull and tossed bones at Kirby, but was actually a helpless little gumdrop beneath. Honestly, he was kind of forgotten after Kirby 64 until he became a regular enemy again in Kirby Planet Robobot, and has been in the mainline game series ever since. In terms of design, the anime did change him a bit. Firstly, they gave him arms, most obviously, but they also made his color a great deal more subdued and less saturated. He also has burgundy colored eye markings around the eye sockets. And overall, we also don't see beneath his skull, which makes him a lot more intimidating. His bones also act more like boomerangs than they did in the games. In the Japanese original, he's voiced by noted Japanese voice actor Nobuo Tobita, and he does a fine enough job, though nothing really notable. In the English dub, he is completely silent, which honestly I think works a lot better, with the exception of one scene. Honestly, it was a good reimagining of a slightly forgettable enemy. Escargoon goes over to help the king down as Gabon begins attacking Kirby with his bones. The bones hit the poor puffball so hard he's sent flying, much to Tiff's chagrin, and laughs evilly. Meanwhile, the king complains that Escargoon is taking too long, who tries to undo all the chains. The king falls upon his lackey, which forces Gabon to the floor. This break gives Tiff a chance to tell Kirby to suck him up, and so Kirby does so and manages to eat one of Gabon's bones, but after jumping into the air, it's revealed that Kirby doesn't get an ability from it, and so he falls down and spits out the bone, with Gabon grabbing it. How the others comment on this occasion is changed between versions. In the Japanese original, Meta Knight explains that Gabon has no ability, so there's no use in inhaling it, to which Tiff angrily replies that, why can't you say these things sooner, which is honestly an understandable complaint. In the English dub, this is changed to Meta Knight saying Kirby won't be able to return his attacks, to which Tiff asks, then how is he supposed to stop it? Honestly, I think the Japanese original handled it a bit better, but both sound pretty good. Gabon then begins beating the ever-loving fluff out of Kirby, as we see King Dedede and Escargoon sneaking away. Tuff watches Kirby having no hope and says they gotta help him somehow. Meta Knight, then thinking quick, grabs a torch off the walls and throws it at Kirby and tells him to eat it, and Kirby does so to become... Fire Kirby. We've seen this ability in a total of 5 previous episodes, so please consider checking those reviews out if you want me to go into more detail about this ability, because it's been well covered to such an extent, and this won't be the last time, given that this is by a large margin the most common appearing of all the abilities in the anime series. And I don't really want to be too repetitive, but I'll just say that it translated into the anime really well in both design and ability. Kirby lands upon the enemy sales guy monitor, much to his shock, as Tuff cheers him on. Gabon flings his bone at Kirby, but only manages to damage the monitor, and the sales guy is knocked out of the episode rather pathetically. Kirby then proceeds to breathe fire upon Gabon, and here we see the final change between versions. In the Japanese original, the monster screams, "Hot! Hot! 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 Hot!" in pain as he is consumed by the hellfire. 4Kids removed this for reasons that I don't think were specifically related to this scene, but rather they just didn't want Gabon to speak at all, which I think does somewhat neuter this scene as we don't see him screaming in pain. The kids cheer on Kirby's victory at Homicide as the flames begin to engulf the room. Meta Knight tells them they gotta go as the house is revealed to be highly flammable. The king and Escargoon watch this confused before seemingly being consumed by the flames. We see the fire spread throughout the house as Tiff, Tuff, Meta Knight, and Kirby flee for their lives. And we see that much of what scared us before is basically consumed by the fire. We then after a period of time, see the sun rise, and the charred remains of the home soon collapse into ash. We see that Escargoon and the king have somehow survived, and the two are covered in smoke as they blame each other for the failure of the plan before the two collapse tired. Tiff comments on how they can't cause issues in their sleep, but then wonders where Kirby is. Meta Knight, in what is perhaps the most "I'm just done with it" tone I've ever heard, says that Kirby is over there and points to Kirby, who has also fallen asleep, as the camera cuts to Kirby sleeping like nothing even happened, and the others watch as the episode closes. Now, let's talk about the episode's positives, negatives, and my general thoughts. And frankly, I got quite a bit to say about this episode in particular, and the two-parter as a whole. Firstly, let's talk about the horror, as this episode is widely considered the most disturbing/scary episode in the show, and I can quite frankly see it very easily why. The only one that is anywhere near scary would be episode 39, Escar Gone. It's kind of odd that that episode gets mentioned more than once in this review, but now I'll admit, as a kid, it did spook me, but going back to review it, it's honestly not really that scary as an adult. Especially the 4Kids dub, which really toned everything down, though many of the scenes are still pretty creepy. Now, the CGI in this episode, as well as most of the show, hasn't really aged that best. I think Kirby still looks fine, but I honestly think that the bad CGI actually enhances how disturbing some of these scenes are. I mean, seriously, these are quite horrifying out of context. And I think that while in general bad CGI is a bad thing, I think in this case it actually improves the mood, especially with all these entities in the house. Speaking of the entities, let's talk about them now. The particle ghost, while not particularly present in the later half of the episode, still left a significant impact on my viewing and the episode. And so I do think it was a decent antagonist, even if it was the weakest one of the three. Now, Charbon, before I started watching the episode and general research for this review, I thought it was honestly a somewhat forgettable, if funny, cameo. But upon reflection and rewatching this and doing research, I actually found that there was a far more substantive stuff to talk about with him than I thought. And so now I genuinely consider Charbon to be a far more impactful monster of the week than I thought it would be, and my second favorite of the three in this episode. But the real star of the episode is Gabon, which is a great reinvigoration of an otherwise somewhat bland enemy into a genuinely competent bad guy that very nearly kills Kirby. I also found that enemy sales guy's involvement in the plot in a more active way rather interesting, and is something that was gravely underexplored in the series as a whole. Dedede and Escargoon were funny, though I can't help but feel bad for the parrots at points. Fire Kirby was well utilized, though I am not sure if you can really kill entities that are already dead. But now, let us talk about the episode's flaws, or at least what many people consider flaws. Okay, so technically this first one is kind of a gray area because of reasons I'll shortly get to, but it's all the references that this episode has. Now, I enjoyed all of these references to classic horror and other stuff, but it must be said that these scenes can only really be fully enjoyed if one is aware of them, like myself, meaning that if someone doesn't know those references, they just think it's like a weird scene that they don't really understand. So, because of that, some people have issues with it. Plus, some of the references seem kind of random, like, what is a racem doing there? And the Star Wars joke can be conceived as being gratuitous. Personally, I didn't really have an issue with it, but because so many have talked about it in other discussions, I thought it was worth mentioning just to the bulk of times. For me, the biggest flaw would have had to been all the censorship of the episodes that 4Kids did. Not only did it really neuter the scares, but also it just seemed completely unnecessary. Like, the vulgarity that was removed was so minor that the act of removing it just comes off as unneeded, really. Meta Knight also felt a little unusual in this episode. I just don't quite get some of his actions. Overall, a great episode with some really minor flaws, but now let's talk about the two-parter as a whole. Well, this two-parter is, of the three I've reviewed so far, the best. Unlike the previous one, it seems like a genuinely two-part episode instead of two largely independent episodes with a vague connection like that of Prediction Predicament. While it's not my personal favorite, it is in the top three, and in general is well worth a watch if at all interested. However, if you're gonna watch this, you really need to watch part one first, and so you should put off some time to watch both back to back. And that is one other flaw of two parts as a whole, but because that's something that's not unique to this episode in particular, I didn't really feel it was fair to take off it as well. This is a problem that all two-parters have, and it would be unfair for me to dock one episode for that. Anyway, I'm the Dark Master, and join me next time on the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. Have a wonderful day, and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of this sort of videos. Peace out.